The military appreciation ceremony was supposed to be a pleasant evening. Retired service members, active duty personnel, and their families filled the community hall. Flags lined the stage. Conversations drifted between old memories and shared experiences. I had attended events like this before, but this time several relatives had come with me, including my Uncle Robert. At first, everything felt comfortable. Then someone asked about my years in uniform. It was a simple question, one I had answered many times. Before I could say much, my uncle chuckled and waved a dismissive hand. Let's not get carried away. The nearby conversation quieted. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. My uncle leaned back in his chair. Linda served, sure. But people throw the word hero around too easily these days. A few relatives shifted awkwardly. I stared down at my coffee cup. Then came the sentence that landed harder than he probably realized. You were never a hero. The words hung in the air. Nobody laughed. Nobody responded. The silence felt worse. Heat rose into my face as years of similar comments rushed back to me. I was already searching for a way to change the subject when I noticed movement nearby. A man in dress uniform had stopped mid-conversation. The insignia on his shoulders identified him immediately, base commander. And, judging by the expression on his face, he had heard every word. More importantly, he didn't seem pleased by what he had heard. The look on the commander's face pulled me backward through years of memories I usually tried not to revisit. My Uncle Robert had always been the kind of man who believed he understood everything worth understanding. If someone earned a promotion, he had advice. If someone started a business, he had opinions. If someone succeeded publicly, he was usually the first to praise them. But only if he could easily measure the achievement. Growing up, I learned that quiet effort rarely impressed him. Discipline didn't impress him. Reliability didn't impress him. Consistency didn't impress him. What impressed him were visible victories, the kind that came with applause. My cousins often received enthusiastic praise for athletic achievements, sales records, and career milestones. When I worked hard, the response was usually different. That's what you're supposed to do. Good. Keep it up. Nothing special about being responsible. The comments weren't cruel enough to start arguments, just dismissive enough to leave a mark. Over time, those small moments accumulated. They shaped family conversations, family expectations, even family assumptions, because Uncle Robert spoke with such confidence. People often accepted his judgments without question. If he praised someone, others followed. If he minimized something, others tended to do the same. When I joined the military, that pattern continued. He never openly criticized my decision. Instead, he reduced it, turned years of commitment into something ordinary, something unremarkable, something not quite worthy of respect. The strange thing was that I never fully understood why. Why was he so determined to dismiss accomplishments that had nothing to do with him? At the time, I didn't have an answer. I only knew that the pattern followed me into adulthood. And it became even more noticeable during my years of military service. Military service never became the center of my identity. It became part of how I lived. For more than 20 years, I balanced military responsibilities with a civilian career and family obligations. There were training schedules to meet, certifications to maintain, and leadership duties that followed me long after official work hours ended. Most people only saw fragments of it. A uniform hanging in a closet, an occasional ceremony, a photograph taken during training. What they didn't see were the sacrifices hidden between those moments. The early mornings, the late-night planning sessions, the weekends spent away from home, the constant effort required to remain prepared for responsibilities that could arise at any time. I never viewed those sacrifices as extraordinary. They were simply part of the commitment I had made. Over the years, I worked with remarkable people. Some became lifelong friends. Others became mentors. A few became memories I carried with me long after assignments ended. Each experience taught me something valuable about responsibility, leadership, and service. Yet I rarely spoke about any of it, partly because military culture encourages humility, partly because I learned early that most people weren't particularly interested, especially within my own family. Whenever conversations drifted toward my service, Uncle Robert usually found a way to redirect attention elsewhere. Eventually, I stopped volunteering information. It felt easier than explaining, easier than defending experiences that shouldn't have required defense in the first place. The result was predictable. People filled the silence with assumptions because I didn't talk about my accomplishments. Relatives assumed there weren't many because I didn't seek recognition. They assumed there was little to recognize. Years passed that way. Quietly, the reality of my service remained largely invisible to the people closest to me. Sometimes I wondered whether anyone truly understood what those years represented, whether anyone saw beyond the uniform, whether anyone appreciated the commitment hidden behind ordinary appearances. Standing at the military appreciation ceremony years later, I was about to discover that at least one person did, and his reaction would bring everything to the surface. The evening had started well enough. Veterans shared stories at nearby tables. Families mingled between displays honoring different branches of service. The atmosphere felt warm and respectful. For a while, I managed to blend into the background. That had always been my preference. Then a woman seated at our table noticed a photograph in the event program. "Isn't that you?" she asked. I glanced down and smiled. The picture had been taken years earlier during a leadership training event. Soon a few guests began asking questions. Nothing complicated. Where had I served? How long had I been in uniform? What kind of work had I done? I answered briefly. The conversation remained comfortable until Uncle Robert decided to join it. He laughed softly and shook his head. "Don't let her fool you." The table immediately grew quieter. I recognized the tone. Others did too. "She always makes it sound more impressive than it was." Several guests exchanged uncertain glances. I felt the familiar sting of embarrassment. Then came the comment, the one that stopped every conversation nearby. "You were never a hero." Silence followed. Heavy silence, the kind that makes people suddenly interested in their drinks. I wished the floor would open beneath me. Not because I believed him, because I was tired. Tired of defending things that shouldn't require defense. Across the room, movement caught my attention. A senior officer in formal dress uniform had paused mid-conversation. He was looking directly toward our table, toward us, toward my uncle. The commander's expression remained controlled, but there was something unmistakable in his eyes. Recognition, interest, perhaps even concern. I couldn't understand why. At that moment, all I knew was that he had heard the comment, and for some reason, it seemed to matter to him. After the conversation faded, I found myself staring at the tablecloth instead of the people around me. The room was still full of laughter and conversation, yet I felt strangely isolated. That wasn't entirely my uncle's fault. His words hurt because they echoed doubts I had carried for years. Not often, not loudly, but often enough. Military service had always meant something to me. The friendships, the responsibility, the sacrifices, the lessons learned under pressure. Yet because I rarely spoke about those experiences, I sometimes wondered whether I had assigned them more importance than anyone else would. Maybe Uncle Robert saw something I didn't. Maybe the years I remembered so clearly were ordinary. Maybe the commitment I valued wasn't particularly remarkable. The thoughts embarrassed me. Still, they lingered. Years of criticism have a way of planting questions that logic alone can't remove. Then I looked across the room again. The commander was still watching, not casually, intently, as though something about the situation had captured his full attention. That made no sense to me. A man with his responsibilities had no reason to care about a private family conversation. Yet he clearly did. A few moments later, he excused himself from the group he had been speaking with. Then he started walking toward our table. The closer he came, the quieter my thoughts became, because suddenly, one question mattered more than all the others. What did the commander know that I didn't? The commander stopped beside our table and offered a polite smile. The conversations around us faded almost immediately. People noticed when someone of his rank approached, especially at an event like this. "Good evening," he said. His voice was calm and professional. I returned the greeting, unsure of what was about to happen. Then he looked directly at me. "You're Linda Parker, correct?" My surprise must have shown. "Yes, sir." He nodded. I thought so. That simple response immediately caught my attention. Not because he knew my name, because he seemed genuinely pleased to recognize it. The commander pulled out an empty chair and sat down. To my astonishment, his attention remained focused on me, not on the crowd, not on the event, on me. "How many years did you serve?" he asked. 23. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's a remarkable commitment." Before I could respond, he asked another question, then another. The conversation quickly became more detailed than anything I expected. He asked about leadership assignments, training responsibilities, deployment support operations, mentorship programs, the kinds of topics only someone familiar with military service would think to ask. Each question revealed a level of understanding that surprised me. Even more surprising was the respect behind them. He wasn't making small talk, he was genuinely interested. Around the table, family members began paying closer attention. My uncle remained silent. For once, he wasn't leading the conversation. He was listening. The commander nodded thoughtfully as I answered. Several times he smiled, as though confirming something he already suspected. That unsettled me more than anything else, because it raised an obvious question. How did he know so much? When I finally paused, the commander leaned back slightly. The expression on his face carried the quiet confidence of someone preparing to explain something important. And, judging by the way the room had grown silent around us, everyone wanted to hear what came next. The commander looked around the table before speaking. His expression remained calm, but there was a quiet conviction behind it that immediately captured everyone's attention. "You know," he said, "one of the biggest misconceptions people have about military service is that they think heroism only happens in dramatic moments." No one interrupted. The room seemed to lean closer. The commander continued. "People imagine a single event, a battlefield story, a headline, a medal ceremony." He paused briefly. "Those moments exist, but that's not what defines most military careers." I felt something shift inside me, not because of what he was saying, because of how familiar it sounded. He was describing something I had struggled to explain for years. The commander folded his hands. "Service is often much quieter than people realize." Several guests nodded. He continued. "It's showing up year after year, remaining ready when others are sleeping comfortably, accepting responsibilities that don't disappear simply because life becomes difficult." The room remained silent, listening, absorbing. For the first time that evening, I noticed relatives looking at me differently, not with sympathy, with curiosity. The commander spoke about leadership, about mentoring younger service members, about training and preparedness, about the thousands of ordinary decisions that allow military organizations to function effectively. None of it sounded glamorous. That was exactly the point. "Most military careers are built on consistency rather than headlines," he said. The word settled over the room. Consistency, discipline, commitment. The qualities Uncle Robert had spent years overlooking. The commander smiled slightly. "Some of the most valuable people in uniform are individuals most civilians will never read about in newspapers." A few people glanced toward me. The attention made me uncomfortable, yet it also felt strangely validating. For years, I had quietly carried responsibilities that rarely attracted recognition. Now someone was describing those responsibilities as meaningful, important, even. The commander turned toward me again. His expression became thoughtful, almost reflective. "As a matter of fact," he said, "Linda's record is a perfect example of that." My heart skipped. The room became noticeably quieter. because suddenly this conversation was no longer about military service in general. It was about me. And, judging by the commander's tone, he was about to share details very few people in that room had ever heard before. The commander folded his hands on the table and looked directly at me. For a moment, I wished he wouldn't. Not because I was uncomfortable with the truth, because I had spent years avoiding attention. What happened next left me speechless. "Linda won't tell you this herself," he said, glancing around the table, "because people with her kind of record rarely do." A few guests smiled, the commander continued. Over 23 years of service, she held multiple leadership positions responsible for training and mentoring younger personnel. Several relatives exchanged surprised looks. I wasn't surprised. I was stunned that he knew. The commander spoke as though he had reviewed my career personally. He described assignments that required long hours and significant responsibility. Training programs I had helped coordinate, teams I had supervised, projects that affected far more people than most civilians would ever realize. The room listened carefully.
No one interrupted.
No one looked away. Then, he mentioned something I had nearly forgotten: a deployment support operation years earlier. One of the most demanding periods of my career. The commander explained how responsibilities during that assignment extended well beyond ordinary duties. How leadership decisions made behind the scenes often affected the success of entire operations. Suddenly, experiences that once seemed invisible sounded important, meaningful. Not because he exaggerated them, because he understood them. The commander then shifted to something even more personal. One of the most overlooked contributions in military service is mentorship. His eyes met mine briefly. Linda spent years helping younger service members develop professionally and personally. The words hit harder than any praise because they reflected what mattered most to me. Awards were nice. Recognition was appreciated. But helping people grow had always been the part I valued most. The commander nodded thoughtfully. "I've spoken with individuals who served alongside her." That revelation startled me. Around the table, relatives leaned forward. The commander smiled. The same qualities come up repeatedly. He counted them off calmly. Integrity. A pause. Reliability. Another pause. Leadership. The room remained silent, not awkwardly, respectfully. For years, family members had viewed my service through assumptions and incomplete information. Now they were hearing about it from someone whose opinion carried undeniable authority. I glanced toward my uncle. For once, he had nothing to say. His usual certainty had vanished. The same relatives, who once treated my military career as a footnote, were now looking at it differently, looking at me differently. And, as the commander continued speaking, I realized something important. The story my family had told itself about me for years was quietly falling apart. And everyone in the room could see it happening. The change wasn't dramatic. No one stood and applauded. No one made a speech.
Yet the atmosphere around me felt completely different.
The commander had done something simple but powerful. He had replaced assumptions with facts. And facts have a way of changing people. Guests who had barely spoken to me earlier now approached with genuine interest. Veterans from neighboring tables introduced themselves. Several asked thoughtful questions about my service. Others simply thanked me. The conversations felt different from the polite exchanges I was used to. There was respect behind them. Real respect, not because of my rank or years served, because people finally understood the commitment those years represented. Even my relatives seemed uncertain how to respond. My cousins looked at me with a mixture of surprise and admiration. An aunt quietly squeezed my shoulder as she walked past. One family member admitted she had never realized how much responsibility military leadership involved. The social balance of the room had shifted. The person who had spent years blending into the background was suddenly being seen more clearly. Across the table, my uncle remained unusually quiet. His confidence appeared shaken, not by confrontation, by information. The commander hadn't embarrassed him. He had simply revealed a truth that no longer fit my uncle's version of the story. Watching him, I felt something unexpected: curiosity, because the question that mattered now wasn't whether he had been wrong. The question was why he had spent so many years insisting that I was. And the answer turned out to be far more complicated than I ever imagined. The ceremony ended later that evening, but the conversation stayed with me. So did my uncle's silence. For most of my life, Uncle Robert always seemed to have an opinion ready, a joke, a criticism, a reason why someone else's accomplishment wasn't quite as impressive as it appeared. That night, however, he said very little. As guests gradually departed, I stepped outside to enjoy the cool evening air. The parking lot was nearly empty. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Uncle Robert. For a moment, neither of us spoke, then he sighed. "You had quite a fan club in there." The comment carried a familiar edge, but it sounded weaker than usual. I smiled slightly. "I don't think that's what happened." "No?" He shoved his hands into his pockets. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable, not angry. Uncomfortable. Eventually, he shook his head. "You know, when I was younger, military service looked different." I listened. The statement wasn't an apology. It was something else. An explanation. "My father served," he continued. "Most of the men I grew up around served." There was a pause. They talked about combat, deployment stories, dangerous situations. I nodded. I understood where he was going. Uncle Robert had spent decades measuring military value against a very narrow definition. If service didn't match that picture, he struggled to understand it. But there was more beneath the surface. I could hear it. He stared toward the dark horizon. "When people started praising your career, I never knew what to do with it. That surprised me." "Why?" He laughed softly. Not because anything was funny, because the truth embarrassed him. Because I didn't understand it. The answer hung between us, simple, honest, painful. Over the years, he had dismissed things he couldn't easily measure: leadership, mentorship, readiness, discipline, the quieter parts of military service. But another truth slowly emerged as we talked. His skepticism wasn't only about misunderstanding, it was also about regret. Uncle Robert admitted he had once considered military service himself. Life had taken him in a different direction, a direction he rarely discussed. Listening to him, I began to realize something. Every time he minimized my accomplishments, he wasn't only reacting to me. He was reacting to his own unresolved feelings, his own assumptions, his own disappointments. That realization changed everything, not because it excused the hurt. It didn't. But it transformed years of mystery into understanding. For the first time, I saw my uncle not as a critic, but as a flawed man carrying burdens I had never fully recognized. And once I understood that, another question surfaced. If his approval had always been limited by his own perspective, why had I spent so many years needing it at all? A few days after the ceremony, I found myself thinking less about my uncle and more about the commander's words, not the compliments, the perspective behind them. For years, I had quietly measured parts of my life against other people's reactions. A promotion felt smaller if someone dismissed it. An accomplishment felt less meaningful if nobody acknowledged it. I never intended to think that way. Yet somewhere along the line, I had allowed outside opinions to influence how I viewed my own experiences. The ceremony changed that. The commander's recognition mattered because it came from understanding. He knew what those years represented: the sacrifices, the responsibilities, the commitment required to keep showing up long after the excitement faded. But even that wasn't the most important lesson. The real lesson was simpler. Honor doesn't come from applause. It doesn't come from medals, ceremonies, or public praise. Those things may recognize honor. They do not create it. Honor is built quietly, one decision at a time, one responsibility accepted, one promise kept. Looking back on my military career, I realized the moments that mattered most were rarely the ones that received recognition. They were the moments when someone needed help, and I was there. The moments when younger service members needed guidance. The moments when responsibility outweighed convenience. Those experiences shaped who I became, not because anyone was watching, because they mattered. For the first time in years, I felt genuine pride in my service, not defensive pride, not pride that required validation, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from knowing your value, regardless of who notices it. And once I reached that understanding, I found myself carrying a sense of peace that had been missing for far too long. All that remained now was deciding how to carry that lesson forward. Several weeks later, I attended another small veterans gathering. Nothing formal, just coffee, conversation, and familiar faces. As I listened to old stories and quiet laughter, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened since the ceremony. The strange thing was that my life hadn't changed very much. I still woke up in the same house, spent time with the same people, followed the same routines, yet something inside me felt different, lighter. For years, I had unknowingly carried a burden that was never mine to carry, the need to prove myself, the hope that one day, certain family members would finally understand my value. Now, I saw how exhausting that had been. My uncle and I still spoke. Our relationship wasn't perfect. It probably never would be, but I no longer felt responsible for convincing him of anything. That freedom was a gift. The commander's words had helped me understand something I should have known all along. The worth of my service was never dependent on recognition, not from family, not from strangers, not even from military leaders. Recognition can be meaningful, it can be healing, but it does not create value. It simply reveals value that already exists. As I left the gathering that afternoon, I paused for a moment beneath a clear blue sky and smiled. My uncle had said I was never a hero. Perhaps he was still deciding what that word meant. I no longer needed to. I had spent years serving, leading, helping, and showing up when it mattered. That was enough, more than enough, because true service does not become valuable when someone recognizes it. Recognition simply helps others see what was there all along.